You're joining us to host a workshop on conflict and engineering leadership. And this conversation today is going to be a little bit of a window into that experience and what will happen during that summit. You shared that this was about conflict optimization, not resolution. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why that distinction, because I love the distinction between those two phrases and what that means in this conversation today. So can you bring us into why that distinction for conflict?
That's an amazing question. I think when it comes to conflict, if you have a workshop and you're saying to people, "Hey, come to my workshop. I'm going to teach you how to resolve conflict," you're really letting people know that you're focusing on what happens after conflict has taken place. Whereas when you think about conflict optimization and the focus on the workshop itself is definitely interested in, what are all the things that happen before conflict even takes place? How do we avoid the kind of interpersonal conflict that would requires resolution and mediation of some kind? Although I do cover some of the techniques and processes for mediating conflict after it has occurred. Ultimately, I think what's important, and as engineering leaders, our responsibility is to create an environment that optimizes conflict. And, the correct amount of conflict is not zero, right? If there's no give and take, if there's no, mutual alignment of interests, even in cases where they are not intrinsically aligned, you have to work and collaborate together to make them aligned. Healthy conflict is a part of the everyday work that we do.
I love that idea of the optimal amount of conflict is not zero. I think it's a really great way to phrase that. And so I think what's really special about this, Jordan, is you bring a lot of your own personal experience as an engineering leader to this, in like the deep curiosity around this. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how conflict became important to you and how it's really shown up for you as an engineering leader, because I think as we've talked about offhandedly, like in offhand conversations, how just in general, like there's a certain culture or challenge about being a technical leader that oftentimes we maybe are a little bit more conflict averse. Can you talk a little bit more about your observation with conflict and engineering leadership, what people typically default to, and then why this became important to you?
First of all, there's a selection bias in engineering leadership, as there is in any kind of leadership. And I think the selection bias here in our industry is towards folks who are agreeable, reconciliatory, who care about each other, and are thoughtfully inclusive. The problem is that when you select for people like that, sometimes they can be conflict avoidant, and conflict avoidant isn't optimal, right? If you're not able to advocate for the interests of your team, if you're not able to find where your mission statement, your team's mission statement conflicts with another team's mission statement, and then collaboratively reconcile that, then you're going to get run over roughshod. And I think, I experienced a lot of this in my time as an individual contributor at Google and at other workplaces where we didn't have the kind of clarity of responsibility or kind of delineation of team mission statements that were mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive in a way that enabled us to function organically, independently of each other. And we had a lot of times where, okay, these two teams are basically trying to do the same thing. We have to compete with each other while also collaborating with each other. And that's a very challenging line to walk.
Let's dive in more to this topic. So maybe let's start off with when you're talking about conflict, what is conflict? What do you mean by that? And then can you share a little bit more about like what causes it to appear in the workplace or specifically within an engineering organization? You're mentioning a couple like conflicting mission statements. Like let's dive deep into some of those things.
Yeah. So I think, when it comes to like what is conflict, there are a lot of different perspectives on this. And mine comes from, the process philosophy world. And in particular, within this realm of conflict, there's a school of thought called conflict transformation. And within conflict transformation, there's a couple notable folks who have defined kind of what conflict is. I'll go through a couple of these because I think there's some interesting ideas here. The first is David Anderson Hooker, who defines conflict as two ideas sharing space, two intentions sharing the same space. And Diana Francis, who defines it as the friction caused by difference, proximity, and movement. And I think that essentially, to me, what that means is conflict is just a part of the process of collaboration, of competing interests in a sort of abstract sense, working through us as individuals, as kind of gears within a broader social machinery. And conflict is necessary. There's some amount of friction necessary because we have diversity of value, diversity of interest, diversity of mission. And within the workplace, that often looks like certainly interpersonal value conflict, but it can also look like interorganizational value conflict. As an example, the Google Chrome team and the Google Search team have very different ideas or values around the web. Not super, super different, but different enough to create conflict between the two when it comes to choosing to collaborate together to manage the web. And so I think that, conflict is necessary in the workplace, right? If you have a tax software company and you have a product team whose really their mission is very clearly go out and make as many amazing tax products as you can as quickly as you can, and a legal team whose objective it is to make sure that every product release minimizes negative impact or liability to the company. Well, those two things are necessarily going to be at odds. And so finding the balance between them, that kind of even point where both interests are met, that collaborative approach requires some amount of conflict. And so finding a way to do that conflict healthfully and constructively is critical to any kind of leadership. And I think thinking about conflict in this way helps us optimize for it as opposed to avoiding it because, nobody wants to get into a screaming match. We're not those kinds of people.